Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us. It's really good to see so many new and old faces here. My name is Michael Weisberg. I am the director of Perry Woodhouse this year, and it's my pleasure to welcome you. I'm sure, like all of you, the news these days is just truly shocking, and it's incredibly hard to know what to make of it. I think many of us feel angry, uncertain, frightened, and in times like this, one of the roles that universities play is to try to help make sense of a world that can seem really upside down. And so when we put this event together, what we decided to do was to bring our own experts together. So I am really delighted today, and I'm looking forward to learning with you today from a really terrific group of experts on the conflict in the Middle East. So I'm just going to very briefly introduce them to you, and we're going to go right into it. Before I do that, I want to let you know that we've, because there are so many attendees in person and so many attendees online, all questions are going to go via this Qualtrics form. You should have received a QR code. You can put your questions into Qualtrics. I will see some of them, but also they'll help us figure out further programming to do on this topic. So I encourage you to really put your questions in. So now let me introduce to you our panel today. So immediately to my right is Professor Zaid Rad Al-Hussein, who is the Perry Woodhouse Practice Professor of Human Rights. Zaid is has a long and very distinguished career as a diplomat. He has been the Jordanian ambassador to the United States, the United Nations, and also served as the Deputy High Commissioner for Human Rights. And it's really a great pleasure, Zaid. Did I say Deputy High Commissioner for Human Rights? I demoted you. Oh my goodness. Maybe that's just wishful thinking. Zaid, welcome. To Zaid's right is Trudy Rubin, who is a fellow many years now for Perry Woodhouse and a columnist in the Philadelphia Inquirer. Trudy has covered the conflict in the Middle East for decades and has interviewed pretty much every single person involved in the conflict. And so it's really great pleasure, Trudy, to welcome you to your second home, Perry Woodhouse. And to Trudy's right is Professor Guy Grossman of the Political Science Department. Guy is an expert in all of these issues, as well as issues around displacement and migration, and has served in the Israeli Defense Forces as an officer. So it's really a great pleasure to welcome all of you. And I'm going to just throw out the first question, starting with Trudy. Both the Israeli government and the United States government have referred to the events of last week as Israel's 9/11. Can you talk about what this could mean and how this is similar and how this is different?
Right. Yes, of course. Is it on? Yes. I think that one thing that they have in common, which is so in your gut visible, is the shock of it all. I think that, well, many of you may not either have been around or been old enough to remember the shock of 9/11, where something that no one had ever imagined took place, and the horror was almost unspeakable. And it had a personal nature. After 9/11, everyone was trying to figure out if by 1 or 2 or 6 degrees of separation, they had a contact with someone who died. And I remember that the New York Times ran little profiles of every single person who died. And I and all my friends got up in the morning to look at those profiles, and it made it hit home because it was people that could have been your neighbor, and in one case was my neighbor. In a smaller country like Israel, 1,000 people is, I think somebody said, 11 times the number killed in 9/11 in proportion to population. It's the immediacy. And in Israel, almost everybody Jewish does know someone who was killed, injured, or wounded. And many of people I know have been going to many funerals. So I think that is one of the most common factors. The difference is also great. Al-Qaeda was a foreign entity. Very few people knew at the time about its origins in Afghanistan. It came in secretly, and then it was later chased back in the Afghan and other wildernesses. But Israel has a long history with Hamas since 1987, when it originated in Gaza. And it's intertwined with a bigger issue, the Palestinian issue, which will not disappear after Hamas is destroyed, or if it can be destroyed. Hamas was a charity. It's been the government in Gaza by force since 2007, forgive me, after being elected, but the government was never formed. It took over by force and drove out the other party and militia, Fatah. And so there has been a modus vivendi for a long time with Hamas, something Israel called mow the lawn. Every few years, Israel would have to go in when rockets were fired. There would be bloodshed on both sides, destruction, and then quiet for a long time. And until this latest horror, the government in Israel thought they had a modus vivendi with Hamas. You let Qatar pay them off, you let workers from Gaza come in, and you could live with them until the next mow the lawn. So I think the biggest difference is that the US started a global war on terror and chased terrorists around the world. But in the case of Hamas, Hamas is a story that is right next to Israel. And no matter what happens in Gaza now, the Hamas story won't really end, because depending on the aftermath, you could have Hamas 2, or you could have Hamas regrown, or even if it dies and there's no immediate successor, Gaza and its population will still be there, and some other movement or persons or government has to run Hamas. And there will be resentments afterwards that will be deep. So Hamas cannot be dispatched with, as Osama bin Laden could be run down and killed in Pakistan.
Thanks, Trudy. And we'll, of course, come back to many of these issues in the rest of our time together. Zaid, I wonder if I can turn to you on the same question. I mean, is this Israel's 9/11?
Well, I think Trudy has answered the question of the shock provided. I think there's no doubt it's the nature of the attack on the 7th of October, 50 years after the October War of 1973. And there's an interesting, initially one thought, well, there may be an interesting parallel with that war, because preceding that war, the Egyptians had warned the director of military intelligence in Israel that the war would commence the next day. There were some false indications, or rather indications before the October War, when the war would be launched between, by Egypt and Syria against Israel. And in this case, apparently, the Egyptians did also warn Israel beforehand that there could be an attack. But the nature of the attack was markedly different from previous attacks, which tend to focus on bombings, which are indiscriminate in their nature, or missilery, also indiscriminate. And this was more along the lines of what Yuval Harari recently said. These were reminiscent of the attacks by the Einsatzgruppen, or the Police Reserve Battalion 101 in Poland in 1941. Execution style in many respects, and predominantly civilians, with the taking of hostages, kidnappings, and there was no limit. It was children, families killed in front of each other. And the horror of it, I think, was deliberate, because it works at the psyche, at the root of all fears within Israel that stem back to patterns of persecution and the horrors of the Holocaust. And I think that's almost by intention. The other effect, I think, is that it sort of generates creates in the mind of everyone who's watching this the belief that whatever hope we had at peace is quickly or can so quickly be extinguished. And like that, you know, moments of great hope are basically tranquilized for the following decade or so. When you see what the feeling in the 1990s was like after the end of the Cold War, the fact that so much could be possible and then destroyed by 9/11 and the aftermath of 9/11 that set in course two wars that drained America's resources, demoralized the West, and set in train a whole set of other issues. And I think this is in part maybe the parallel that may come about from this. And clearly from the Arab point of view, once again, one understands this, that the price to be paid for the horrors that Hamas has visited on the Israelis, particularly all the peaceniks and the kibbutzes, sorry. These are people who are hardly, you know, attacking West Bankers in the settlements. That whole dimension of it, I think, the Arabs fully realize that those who are going to pay the price will be the civilians of Gaza, who are trapped in between these two dynamics, and the full fury and vengeance of the Israeli government and people who are traumatized by the events will be, you know, be brought down on their heads. And clearly now there is a space for a negotiation. The 200 or so hostages, 199. There's a negotiation in place where, in exchange for, you know, water and food and humanitarian access, those hostages must be released. And you know, it's high stakes gambling. Let's hope it works, because any war averted will be good. The thing is, of course, Israel still has to deal with Hamas, and from the Arab side, there's always this concern that the enemies of peace are on both sides, regrettably, and not just on both sides, but beyond the region itself as well. And all of us who want to see peace have to battle through them and with the external circumstances that exist as well. So it's a very difficult process, and we'll get to that in the course of this discussion, and happy to answer any questions anyone will have.
Thanks. And Guy.
Can you hear me? Yeah, thanks. So just before I start, thanks, Michael, for organizing this. And I want to mention that I'm participating in this event and in this conversation, both as a human being and Israeli, but also as a social scientist. And as a human being, I wanted to first, just be clear how sad we all are, and how deeply devastated, but also angry, and how we're afraid of what the future lies for Israel, for Gaza, and the greater region. And I think many people in this room share these feelings, and I want to recognize them. But I'm also a social scientist, and as a social scientist, what I need to do is kind of step back from my emotions and try to understand analytically what has happened. Okay, and so going back, Michael, to your question, the comparison to 9/11, I understand the psychological need to compare to past traumatic events. It helps process the trauma, but we lose something when we do that, because it comes at the expense of some clarity. Obviously, there's parallels between 9/11 and October 7th, but I think these two events need to be considered in their own terms. And I just want to mention 4 key issues that make this a truly monumental event for Israel. And some of them were mentioned by my colleagues. I'll just go them briefly. I think the first one is just the sheer scale of harm. It is an event in which everyone knows someone. It affects everyone. It is not just another terror attack. It is extremely, extremely personal. The second point that I want to make goes back to something that Ziad mentioned about the programs on the Holocaust, and I think he's spot on. There's something very 2023 in this attack, but there's also something very pre-establishment of Israel. The 2023 is the fact that the Hamas was able to post videos of the atrocities on social media, which meant that everyone was able to see collectively in their own eyes the sheer scale of the horror, the babies that were murdered, the pregnant women that were murdered, the people that were kidnapped, the mutilation of bodies. We were all able to see that in a way that really sparked these memories that Ziad mentioned about pogroms that Jews faced in Dhaka times of my people. And this is important because this speaks to the foundation, the reason for the existence of Israel. And so in addition to the sadness that people feel, there's also a sense of betrayal that the government didn't do what it's supposed to do, didn't do the most basic function of what the Israeli state needs to do, which is to make sure that these things never happen again. The third aspect that I think is important to mention with respect to this attack is that it truly represents a tectonic shift in how Israelis are thinking about the conflict. I think this is really important to understand. Speaking to Israelis from across the political spectrum in the last week, it is clear that there's a wide consensus that the previous strategy of containment of an organization like the Hamas is not tenable anymore. There's a wide recognition that the Hamas is committed to the destruction of Israel, and Israel should not accept on its border a proto-state organization with military capabilities like the Hamas that is committed to destruction of the people. And I want to be clear that this is a new perception. This idea that the public will not accept and the government will not accept such an entity on the Israeli border. I do not know how long this perception will continue. This is unknown, but I think that this perception for many years will really structure Israel's policies and actions. And the last point that I want to make about the question of the comparison to 9/11. Look, October 7th is obviously a colossal intelligence failure, but it's very different from the way we think about the US failure. You know, the United States was not, preparing for such an attack. It came out of more or less nowhere, as you had mentioned. Israel has been preparing for this for many, many, many years, right? This is the most secured border maybe in the world. And so while 9/11 was not considered a political failure, if you think about the days after the approval rating of President Bush was in the 90%, that is not the case in Israel. In addition to the sadness, there is tremendous anger against the government, tremendous disappointment, all the way up from the head of the military to the intelligence, but also the political arm. And the fact that the state didn't function in the days after made Israelis livid. Like, people are angry, and angry not just towards the Hamas, but angry towards their own government. And we need to understand, this is important to note, because Netanyahu is now fighting also for his political survival. And the reason so many Israelis were happy with the unity government, the fact that Gantz and Eisenkot got in, is not only because people think of them as a bit more moderate, but also because it gives the Israel somewhat more confidence in a moment of complete distrust of the government, in the complete moment of, as I said, lack of trust, that if they're in the room, Israel is more likely to engage in actions that are responding to Israel's national security and not to Netanyahu's political survival.
Thank you so much, Guy, and thanks to all of you for setting the stage so well about what has happened. For the next question, I want to, Marco, can you just turn the volume down just a tiny bit? We're having a bit of a ring here. I want to walk us back a little bit to just that there's with you know, when Jews are involved, history can go way back, but let's just go back a little bit. I wonder if you can, Trudy, kind of talk about the Oslo period and then kind of run us from there to the present, just to try to give a little more context to what just happened.
I think there are a couple of ways to look at the history of the Oslo Accords, which was the peace between the PLO and Israel. My mic, sorry. There are a couple of ways to look at what happened between 1993, when the Oslo Accords were signed between Israel and the PLO, and now. There is the dry way to look at the negotiations and all of the steps that happened and failed between then and now. And there is the emotional way. And frankly, you know, I feel both very strongly because I was on the lawn in 1993 when Arafat and Rabin at the White House and Clinton, I saw him put his arms around them. It seemed very impossible. I knew Arafat's, well, I won't even go into that, his wife. There were so many memories. The whole thing seemed like something out of a dream. And the negotiators that put together Oslo, Israelis and Palestinians, I believe, were truly serious about peace and remained truly serious until the whole thing fell apart. But there were always spoilers. There were spoilers who never wanted peace. There were spoilers who killed the pivotal person, I believe, in this whole peace accord, Yitzhak Rabin. And there were spoilers who picked apart the agreement and stuck knives into it until it was truly a corpse even before this war was started by Hamas. So I'm just going to tread very lightly on some of the key points, but I want to bring out the people who tried so hard and were foiled, because I think they deserve honor. And I think we have to understand a little better why this failed. So in case you haven't taken a course in Middle East studies, the Oslo Accords were signed in '93. The Americans had nothing to do with them. There was another peace process that the US was involved with that was basically trying to get all of Israel's neighbors together on a peace process. And the US was barely aware that Palestinians and Israelis were doing something secretly on their own, which produced an accord in which the PLO recognized Israel. And over a 5-year period, a Palestinian Authority was going to be established and assume governing responsibilities. And then there would be permanent status, talks on a final settlement. Now, there was a very big glitch in the accord. It didn't stop Israeli settlement from continuing while the negotiations went on. And that ultimately turned out to be one of the deep difficulties in keeping this accord going. But I just want to talk for 1 minute about what life was like in Gaza when Arafat and the PLO came back and first had their headquarters in Gaza. And I was spending time in Gaza then. And there was a big debate going on in Gaza between Fatah people, Arafat's party, Fatah, and Hamas. even then. Hamas had been formed in 1987. It was mainly a charity organization, but they never believed in a two-state solution. I was at meetings with Fatah hawks, with Fatah lawyers, where I was the only foreigner in the room, and people from Fatah were urging Arafat to get rid of Hamas because Hamas were Islamists and they were stirring up emotions against the peace accord, even there. And Arafat didn't do it. I think that was one of the seminal moments in this. Arafat wanted to keep all cards in his hand, all factors in play, and the tragedy began developing. The most terrible moment, I believe, was in 1995 in November, when Yitzhak Rabin was assassinated by Jewish terrorists. And the reason I say that is that I think individuals were critical in the success or failure of the peace talks. Rabin didn't trust the Palestinians and Arafat. He was reluctant to shake Arafat's hand, but he recognized that if you didn't have two states side by side in peace, that ultimately Israel would become a one state with an Arab majority, and that Israel then would be waging endlessly an existential fight with the Palestinians. He saw that, and it's why he wanted to make the peace process succeed. He was dubious about a separate state, but I think that his determination and toughness might have been able at that period in the 90s to push the Palestinians and the doubters in Israel and come up with a formula that might have worked. That was history. He died. And after he died, Hamas began conducting terrorist attacks that soured the Israeli public, bus bomb attacks in Jerusalem. And the debate went on inside the territories in Gaza and the West Bank about what to do about Hamas. In 1996, before he was elected prime minister, I interviewed Netanyahu. And here again, individuals count. He was elected in 96, I believe, because of the Hamas bus bomb attacks and the beginning of doubts about the peace process and the death of Rabin. And he said to me something he has kept on saying until now: they can call it a state, but it will never be a state. It will be a state minus, 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 minus. And he listed all the rights that it would never have. And so I think Netanyahu from the beginning was part of an Israeli segment that never believed a state could happen. There were many meetings subsequently, and more territory was given back to the Palestinians. But the Israelis and Palestinians never arrived at the point where final status talks took place. I am going to jump up to 2000, where under Prime Minister Ehud Barak, Camp David II took place. I think that Barak was overconfident. His mind and heart were in the right place, not heart, gut. He understood what Rabin understood. But his proposal lacked elements, and the Palestinians wouldn't come back with a counter proposal. So again, historic opportunity missed. And then turn to the Arafat side. Shortly thereafter, the second intifada started on the West Bank. And I interviewed top Arafat officials, and they said, we're going to talk and fight. They made that decision after, I could sit here all day going into details, and I don't want to get stuck in it. But you had Ariel Sharon going up on the Temple Mount, which caused huge demonstrations by the Palestinians. Then you had the second intifada, where Arafat decided to talk and fight. More terrorist attacks from the Palestinian side, more disillusionment on the Israeli side. And again, a moment at Camp David II lost. I'll just tell you one more anecdote, and frankly, I'm going to fast forward to much closer to now. In this period after the Second Intifada, I think that there were still negotiators, actually before the Second Intifada, after the Camp David talks, Camp David II, negotiations were still going on under President Clinton. And the Palestinians and the Israelis, the people who were doing the actual negotiations, were really making progress. This was in the fall of 2000. They came up with a paper agreement in 2001 in January, which had no legal meaning, but went so far as describing the streets on Israel, the capital of Jerusalem, that would be divided and how it would be one city with two capitals. They came up with formulae for the refugees so that they didn't have to come back to Palestine or Israel. They would be settled from Lebanon in Australia and Canada. This was all written down and was supposed to be announced at the Davos World Economic Forum. And then Kofi Annan, the UN Secretary General, would go with the Israeli and Palestinian teams to Stockholm, where they would read out the Taba Accord that would force subsequent Israeli governments to deal with something that was on paper, even though it had no legal meaning. And Arafat at Davos got up on the stage with Peres, Shimon Peres beside him, and started screaming about the Israelis using phosphorus bombs. And that basically sunk the whole idea of signing the Taba statement at Oslo and making it public in Stockholm. After that, I believe after what happened in 2000 and then the Second Intifada, I think that the peace process was on life support. It went on, but it was interrupted by external events, the 9/11 attack, the war in Iraq, which took the US out of that picture, no longer pushing hard enough for renewing the peace process. And the last gasp happened in 2008, when Israeli Prime Minister Ehud Olmert sat with Mahmoud Abbas, still now the Palestinian Authority president at 86, and showed him a plan which was incredibly generous in the outline of the Palestinian state. Abbas took the plan and never came back to discuss it with Olmert, and Olmert subsequently resigned because of corruption charges, unlike Netanyahu, who is basically trying to undo the Supreme Court so that he won't have to go to jail on corruption charges. So I see this in terms of people, in terms of Rabin, in terms of Arafat's ambivalence, Rabin's death, Olmert's attempt too late, and in the middle, Ariel Sharon pulled out of Gaza. Another tragedy, however, because Hamas took over in Gaza by force, and then a blockade was instituted around Gaza, and Gaza was basically separated from the West Bank and became a sort of open air prison in which Hamas took deeper root, leading to what we see today. So I think we have a situation where good people tried to negotiate peace, and they were done in by assassination, by lack of leadership, by lack of commitment on Arafat's side, by lack of courage on Abu Mazen's side, and by a series of events which then wiped the peace process out of people's minds and led to a point where nobody believed in it anymore. And prior to this war, I was in Israel in April for 2 weeks, and you saw a situation where everyone thought there would be a third intifada on the West Bank. Palestinians thought the peace process was dead. Most Israelis thought the peace process was dead. And no one expected the outburst to come from Gaza because everybody thought that the wall would keep the Palestinians inside. I think history will record the best of intentions and true commitments by the negotiators in 1993, who were done in by the radicals on the Palestinian side and the radicals on the Israeli side, who never thought two states could emerge. And at this point in time, I see even before the Hamas attacks, I saw very little chance that the people who still believed in peace on the Israeli side had a chance to emerge and rebuild a peace process. If you want more history on details, you can get a whole outline of the steps of the peace process since Oslo, easily available at the State Department website or on many different ones. But I think it was a story of human beings and their flaws and their death in the case of Rabin.
Thanks so much, Trudy. And this sets us up nicely for the question I want to ask you, Guy. Why did Hamas choose this time to attack?
Yeah, thanks, Michael, for the question. So there's several reasons, several factors that contributed to the Hamas decision to strike Israel, and some of them are more geopolitics, some are about internal politics in Israel, and some of them are about intra-Palestinian factors. I'm going to just focus on the first two, and maybe Ziad can say something more on the Palestinian side. I'm going to start with geopolitics because I think this is extremely important to understand the moment that we are now. So as many of you know, in recent years, there's been a realignment in the Middle East where some major Sunni countries have been rethinking their strategy to counter increasingly belligerent and possibly nuclear Iran. And this has led some countries in the region, like Bahrain, like the UAE, like Morocco, like Sudan, to sign agreements with Israel. We refer to them usually as the Abraham Accords that normalized relationship with Israel. In exchange, Israel got a recognition, which is really important for Israel. Maybe some more markets, but for the Arab countries, it really meant access to some military technologies that were made available for them. What's so important about the Abraham Accord for our discussion is the fact that they represent a departure from the formula of land for peace that was held for a long time as a way of moving forward towards a more peaceful Middle East. I mean, the land for peace was the basics of the peace agreement with Egypt, to some extent also with Jordan, and that was the basis of the Arab Initiative, the Arab Peace Initiative that was endorsed by the Arab League in 2002 and then again in 2007 and 2017. So this is a clear departure from that big achievement to Israel, and I think it's reasonable to assume that the Hamas striking of Israel was in part as a way of undermining the Abraham Accord and being a spoiler in the normalization process that is being unfolding in recent months between Israel and Saudi Arabia. A lot of people were mentioning Iran in that equation. I don't think that the Hamas takes its marching orders from Iran. It is the interest of the Hamas, if you believe what it says and what it does. It was an interest of the Hamas to spoil a process that entails normalization between Israel and the Arab world, that entails a recognition. Like, why would you support the recognition of the state of Israel if you are committed to its destruction? I think this is really important. This leads me to this focus on the possibility of turning the clock back on the normalization process that has been unfolding in the last year brings me back to a very important lesson that I hope Israel will learn from both 9/11 and from Israel's own experience in 1982 in the Lebanon War, a war that Israel engaged after an Israeli ambassador was assassinated in the UK. A strategic goal of major terror attacks is not just to instill terror and fear. A strategic goal of major terror attacks is also the response the response that might prompt this disproportionate response that will leave the targeted country worse off. Before. Just think about 9/11. The success of Al-Qaeda is not just kidnapping 3 planes. The success of Al-Qaeda is the response of the United States that plunged it into 2 decades of unwinnable wars in Iraq and Afghanistan. And I think that's a really important lesson for Israel as we're thinking about what's going to happen next. Continuous bloodshed is not only humanitarian disaster, a lot of innocent lives dying on both sides, but it can also isolate Israel again in the Middle East, and it can radicalize the moderates on both sides. And I actually think that that's a major reason why Hamas has engaged in what is engaged. It has internalized the possible response of Israel. I want to mention also briefly a few aspects of domestic politics in Israel that are important. The first one is, December 22, Netanyahu's government was sworn in. This is the most right-wing government arguably in the history of the country. It's a government that made it very clear from day one in both statements and actions that its goal is to deepen Israel's control in the West Bank, including annexing parts of the West Bank, if not de jure, definitely de facto. This has led to increase in levels of violence in the West Bank. And as things happen in the West Bank, there's no vacuum. This tends to spill over into Gaza very fast. The second thing that I wanted to mention about domestic politics in Israel is the decision of the Netanyahu government in January 2023 to engage in a dramatic overhaul of the judicial system in Israel. I'm mentioning this because the judicial overhaul that was announced by the government spurred a massive protest movement in Israel. And for those of you who don't follow Israeli politics that closely, I think it's really hard to exaggerate how fractured the Israeli society has been in the last years. And this affected all facets of society, the workplace, friendships, but also the military. Units that were just torn between those that were supporting and those that were objecting to the overhaul. And I think it might be fair to say that part of the Hamas decision, I don't know exactly what's in their mind, but part of the Hamas decision to strike now is because how fractured the Israeli society has been in the past year. And I think there's a lesson here for America too. Polarization is a tremendous source of military weakness, even if we have military might. I want to talk also, so these are just really proximate causes, but I want to talk also about one root cause, which is extremely important. Trudy referred to that when she was talking about what happened in Gaza since 2007, when the Hamas took over by force, deposed the Palestinian Authority. And we need to talk about what the strategy of Israel towards the Hamas, especially since Netanyahu came back to power in 2009. I don't think it's very controversial to say that Netanyahu
governments over the years, he's been in power for quite a long time, has deliberately strengthened the Hamas. He's done it with allowing Qatar, financial support by marginalizing moderates. In many ways, he's strengthened the Hamas. Why would Netanyahu strengthen the Hamas? Well, there's two reasons why he would do that. Obviously, the main goal is to deepen Israel, controlling the West Bank. The idea is very simple. So long as the Palestinians have two different authorities, so long as there's one leadership in the Hamas, in Gaza, which is the Hamas, and another leadership in the West Bank, which is the Palestinian Authority, the Israeli government can always claim that there's no one to talk to because Palestinian Authority doesn't represent the entire Palestinian people. The other reason why Netanyahu had an interest in Hamas in power, because it was a living example of what happens when you withdraw from a territory. The idea is like, we withdrew in 2005, Hamas took over. How can we withdraw from parts of the West Bank? How do we get the guarantees that this won't happen again? And so long as the Hamas was in power, it was a living example of why the left ideas about solving the conflict are untenable. By saying that Israel strengthened the Hamas, we're also saying that the strategy was never about solving the conflict in the last 16 years. The strategy was about containing the conflict. And this was contained by the strategy of containment basically meant, as Trudy said, a massive blockade that was designed to minimize the military capabilities of the Hamas, but also limit Gaza's economic development. But at the same time, you do that when you try to minimize also levels of violence, for example, by granting people from Gaza some permits to work in Israel as a pressure valve, releasing some pressure valves. The problem with this delicate balance, this status quo, it's really hard to maintain it all the time because there's things happen in the world, right? So you can't just, to calibrate without having any burst of violence is just impossible. So every so often, every 2 years or something, there was a major burst of violence. The last one was in May 21. The point that I'm trying to say is that while the Hamas attack may have been a shock, for those of us that follow, it was not a surprise. It was bound to happen. The thing that was shocking is the precision, the audacity, the capabilities, not the shock itself. And so I think it's important to bear in mind that if there's one thing that died, in addition to all the people that died last week and the people that will die moving forward, another thing that died is this idea that the Hamas could be contained, that you can have such a force on the Israeli border. But we have to understand that this is an animal that we have created as well. It's not just an animal that was created out of thin air, out of vacuum. We also bear some responsibility. And when I say the Israeli government bears responsibility, I just want to make sure that we are not like blaming the victim here. The victims have the people that were massacred. There's no blame to them. We're mentioning that because we need to make sure that history doesn't repeat itself. We need to make sure that we understand some of the root causes in order to ensure that past mistakes are corrected when we are thinking about the way forward.
Thanks so much.
Can I
Trudy,
just
if you very briefly, yep.
Very briefly, I just want to add, because I agree with everything that Guy said, there was an assumption up until the moment Hamas crossed the border that the status quo could last indefinitely, exactly. And the position of the current Israeli government was openly expressed that either the people on the West Bank would accept being part of one Israeli state with no political rights, would accept that, or they could leave, or if they rose up, they would be killed. So there was an acceptance widely in the region that the Palestinian issue was just on low boil and that Gaza was cordoned off. I think that one of the main reasons Hamas moved now on the anniversary of the Yom Kippur War was to show that, as with Yom Kippur, the border could be crossed, and to show that the publics in the Arab world would rise up and support the Palestinians at a time when Arab leaders thought they could, in the Gulf and Saudi Arabia, thought that they could make deals with Israel and basically write off the Palestinian issue. And this complicates any future attempt by Saudi Arabia to normalize. And it puts the Palestinian issue back on the calendar. But at the same time, it undermines the possibilities for resolving it because of the fear that it instills in Israel, even more than before this war, about the possibility of a Palestinian entity. And because nobody knows now at all what to do with Gaza, because even if you wipe out Hamas infrastructure, there is still the problem of people in Gaza who are living there, and what is going to happen to them, and who is going to rule them, and how is a future Hamas going to be dealt with. And we're going to talk about that in later questions.
Well, looking at the clock, I hope we get to later questions. Zaid, I was going to ask you, and maybe you can combine questions. I was going to initially ask you about the region and how these issues are being discussed in the Arab world. I was also going to ask you to draw on your expertise as a former president of the Security Council. Maybe you could do a little bit of that and also begin to talk, which I'll ask all of you about, what this could look like the day after. What must the Israeli government be thinking about? What's the most optimistic thing that we could hope for in terms of the resolution of the conflict?
Well, from the Arab point of view, I mean, it's clear that, and the point was raised by Judy, that were it not for the development of settlements, the continued expansion of settlement building, I think many of these smaller episodes where there were glimmers of hope for peace. So clearly, Bibi Netanyahu was not someone in favor of a peace process that was predicated on land for peace. I mean, he fought against Rabin's sort of campaign on this. But once in, he went along with the second interim withdrawal, the wire accords. And so given a circumstance, he could be moved in that direction. And most people believe him to be a very wily and practical politician. But the movement, the political movement in Israel to the right over the course of now a few decades has meant that the space for him to move has been constricted. And so the settlement policies under different governments sort of continued apace. And I think for the Arabs in particular, and then you have Jordan and Egypt that had peace agreements, it put them in an extremely uncomfortable position because they had to make the argument that there would be peace and a peace dividend at the end. But with every step that faltered, the argument was being narrowed in scope. And clearly at the moment, they are both countries are working really hard together with others to try and have the hostages released as soon as possible, and for there then to be some water and humanitarian supplies sent into Gaza. But the frustrations are deep, and I think are also deep because the Palestinians, by and large, and it's not perfect, but with the exception of Hamas and Jihad Islami, they by and large accepted that there would be no armed resistance to the foreign occupation. It wasn't perfect because you had, of course, after the first Intifada, which was essentially stones and slingshots. The second, there was firearm use on both sides, and the casualties were horrific. And you had the Al-Aqsa Martyrs Brigades, which was sort of affiliated with the PA. But by and large, the Israeli establishment accepted that its security cooperation with the Palestinians was working and that there was something there. And the outliers were those who continued to wage war against Israel and not differentiating between civilians and not. The problem, I think, from an Arab point of view, is that there was an acceptance that, well, if they're not going to resist by force of arms, then surely the ethical resistance, the resistance through boycotts and divestments and sanctions, is at least a way that's sort of ethical. You can resist an occupation that's ethical. But of course, in the US and in Israel, there was a ferocious response to that form of resistance to occupation, which then left many in the Middle East wondering, well, what should the Palestinians therefore do? You know, if they resist by force of arms, they are designated as terrorists and killed. If they resist peacefully, they're branded, by some at least, as anti-Semitic and pursuing policies that are at variance with the Oslo Peace Accords. And then, of course, as Guy was saying, and Trudy was saying, you have the Smotrich plan of 2017, which basically calls for the evisceration of any Palestinian identity whatsoever, and subject to certain things also happening. And so there is a great frustration on the Arab street, in the Arab mind, in the Arab world. But I think at the end of it, there has to be hope for peace. I mean, after all, the globe is confronted with these enormous challenges, from nuclear weapons, climate change. We still have the possibility of another pandemic, and we're not safe from that. And these other political, chronic, and sometimes acute, and much that cause so much pain for so many, must be within our grasp in terms of resolving. Now, it seems almost impossible to believe there's a window at this stage. I mean, the anger is so deep, the pain is so great. There's very little space for a debate like this. In most fora, everyone is feeling their own pain and has no space and bandwidth to think of the pain that others may be experiencing, which is why I think this debate is something that's needed. But out of it, we have to believe, and it may not have seemed apparent also during the October War in 1973. I mean, twice the number of casualties that you have now, and most were military. But out of it, you did end up with Camp David. You did end up with a sort of expression of land for peace, which then set the course. And perhaps, you know, it may seem slim at the moment, but maybe if there's a negotiation that takes place on how you deal with the hostages and they are released back to their families, that can set the stage for something. But it's not clear what that something will be, given the attacks on the 7th of October and how the Palestinian Authority can be shown up or basically supported to negotiate the next stage, which would have to be sort of another variation of the final status. But how you do that, as Guy said, with Ben-Gvir and Smotrich in the government, is hard to see. It would have to be a different constellation. And can that happen?
Thanks, Zaid. Guy, maybe the same question. What may we hope for?
I don't think there's a lot of silver linings, but I think if we look up just politically and what's going to happen in Israel, well, it depends on how the conflict will end, of course. Because there's a lot of expectations from the public, but just for a few things, being mindful of the time. The first thing, it's clear that there's going to be both camps are going to engage in some major thinking and major introspection. People on the left need to come to terms with the fact that there are people on the other side that seem to be committed to the destruction of Israel. For a long time, people on the left said, no, or Palestinians, like the armed resistance is just like, it makes sense because of the occupation. What did you do if you were in their shoes? And they just want to live in peace, but maybe that's just like, you can take a non-violent, you can take a violent vow to that. But by and large, most Palestinians want to live in peace. I think a lot of people on the left are coming to terms with that at least there are some factions that probably that is not the case, even though I still believe firmly that the majority of Palestinians want to live in peace. On the right, I think there's a reckoning about the fact that this idea that you can forget from the Palestinians and just some contain them and move forward and be saved by technology and by walls. I think there's some major reckoning that the Palestinians are not going anywhere. They're going to live with us for the foreseeable future, whether Israel gets rid of the Hamas leadership or not. And so I think this idea that we can forget the Hamas and only focus on internal matters in Israel, I think there's a reality check for the right. Maybe one civil lining. I think that Netanyahu is a political corpse at this point. I think the government will not survive. The second the violence subsumes, the people are going to demand his resignation. I don't think his government is going to survive what's going to happen on the street. The people don't trust this government to investigate the events that led to October 7th, and people are demanding answers, and it can't come from this government. If you look at if you look at public opinion poll, I know that in the middle of fighting, that's not the most reliable, but I think the chance that we will be seeing a more moderate centrist government that is more competent, that is more committed to trying to bring people together rather than pitting one against the other, I think is quite high. Does that mean necessarily that there will be a solution? I am not sure, because pastors taught us that when we have major escalations, usually the Israeli public moves to the right. But also, and this I'm going to end with that, the reason I'm not sure what would be the path forward is because of our lack of imagination. I think the left in Israel has been brain dead for a long time, continuing to parrot the same slogans that might have been relevant in 1993, might have been relevant in 1996, might have been relevant maybe in 2000, but probably completely irrelevant after 2002. But our lack of imagination made us go back to the same slogans that made the left in Israel irrelevant for 90% of the population. There's the share of Jewish Israelis that identify as left is less than 18%. Why? Because the slogans are like the two-state solution slogan is irrelevant. So if there's something that I hope will happen is that this tragedy will also force us to think outside of the box and think about different types of configurations that can chart the way forward. What that's going to look like, I don't really know, but the imperative to do that is clear to anyone that cares about this region.
Thanks, Guy. Trudy, the final word is yours.
All right. I think, as Guy said, the future is hard to imagine, but there's three things that I think are imperative if there is any hope of any progress in preventing another Hamas, even assuming this Hamas can be finished, which is a big question mark. First of all, I think there has to be an immediate way to rush humanitarian aid into southern Gaza. We do not know what is going to happen in Gaza. Israel got stuck in Lebanon for 18 years after it invaded in 2002. There are great horrors to come in Gaza, but one thing is clear. If Israel asked half the population to move south, there is still no water, there is no food, there are babies, there are children. And if there is any hope of dealing with anyone in Gaza in the future, there has to be an immediate infusion of aid. I don't know for sure who is blocking, but even if Hamas is telling people not to leave, they are going south. And Egypt is not going to let them come out into the desert because that would create another huge refugee problem because they probably would not be let back into Gaza. So the future, I think, will have a lot to do with how this horrible humanitarian crisis, half of the Gazans involved being children, is handled. And that is playing out even as we speak. The Americans are pressing for the right thing, but there is resistance and there has to be more pressure to get that aid in on a large scale. That's number one. Number two, as Guy said, I think the future also depends on the fall of this Israeli government. However, the huge divisions inside Israel are not going to end. Already, this government is trying to place the blame on the opposition pro-democracy movement that protested the gutting of the Supreme Court. And it is having effect on their supporters, just as Trump's lies have effect on his supporters. So it is crucial that the ministers inside the current cabinet who support annexation and who are encouraging radical settlers at this terribly delicate movement to attack Palestinian villages, which then gives inspiration to Palestinian terrorists, and around the circle goes. It is imperative that a government with such ministers go out and that there be a centrist government. I don't see that ensured in the near term. And we don't know what the results of the attempt to get rid of Hamas, how that will affect the politics. But unless that changes, I think this war, even if it stops for a while, could widen. And lastly, Israel has potential allies with its Arab citizens. And you can read stories now of Arab citizens, including Bedouin citizens, working with Israeli volunteer groups. The pro-democratic opposition has now turned into a massive volunteer operation trying to fill in where the current Israeli government is failing in helping the families of the dead, the wounded, the injured, the towns in the south. Israel's Arab citizens have been treated dismally by the current government and have been further alienated. And whatever is going to happen in the future between Israel and the West Bank, which may blow up if it isn't handled correctly, and Israel and Gaza, whatever is going to happen, it is imperative that Israel's Arab citizens be made to feel part of the country. Otherwise, Israel faces an internal citizen problem within its 67 boundaries. Humanitarian aid, getting rid of the radical pro-annexation ministers and government who have made publicly clear they wanted to drive Palestinians out, and outreach to Israeli Arabs. The latter two can only happen with a new Israeli government. So I can only hope that Guy is correct and that this government will be forced to kick out these ministers who are adding fuel to the fire. But so far, Netanyahu has refused, and his government is still trying to proceed on the destroy the Supreme Court path, which impacts everything else and further divides the country at a critical moment. So I think that those are the three most important things, even before one gets to what the outcome of the war will be, and whether whether anyone can find a new government for Gaza that can stabilize things in a small area that is going to be ruined and half of its population refugees without a new Hamas taking root.
Thanks, Trudy. So we've come to the end and beyond the end of our time together. Let me say once again that this is a really difficult time for so many of us. And I think that the reason that institutions like the university exists and places like Prairie Woodhouse exist is to try in times like this to help us make some sense of it. And I think today we only scratched the surface. It's very clear. We didn't cover many other aspects of this, but I think that in the coming weeks, we'll keep gathering together. You'll hear more from these friends, but also from others, and I hope you'll continue to join us. But as I say, I really think it's important that we all gather here together, and I really thank the audience, both online and in the room, for being here. But most importantly, I really want to thank the wonderful panel today who really gave great insight. And as I say, we only began to scratch the surface. So thanks to the three of you.